The mist came down over Bramfield Hall, the way it always did in October, thick and grey and smelling of wet stone, curling low around the broken fountain in the front court, where no water had run in 11 years. The roses along the south wall had gone to thorns and brittle stems, their heads bowed as though in permanent mourning, and the ivy that climbed the east face of the house had begun to pry loose the mortar between the bricks, patient and unhurried, the way ruin always is. Somewhere beyond the hedges a rook called twice and fell silent. The house was cold in the way that old houses are cold, when there is no longer enough coin to keep every hearth lit, and so only some were lit. And the rest of the room sat shuttered and grey, waiting, inside, in the small breakfast room that faced east to catch what little morning light there was. Miss Elinor Hartley sat with her hands folded in her lap, and did not eat. There was porridge in front of her, thin and grey as the mist outside, and she had already decided, before she sat down, that she would not finish it. She had decided this the way she decided most mornings now, quietly, without ceremony, watching her mother across the table fuss over the ribbon in Cassandra's hair, and not notice that the youngest of them, Margaret, had gone pale about the mouth the way she did when she had not eaten enough the day before. "You will wear the blue," Lady Hartley was saying to Cassandra, tugging at a curl with the particular tenderness she reserved only for her eldest daughter. "The blue becomes you. Mr. Grimshaw is not a man of taste, God knows, but even he will see that you are the handsomest woman in 3 counties, and handsomeness, my dear, is the only currency we have left." Cassandra preened at her own reflection in the window glass. For there was no mirror in the breakfast room any more. The mirror had been sold, along with the good silver, along with the small oil painting of their father that Elinor missed more than she let herself admit. "He is a vulgar little man," Cassandra said, "but I suppose vulgar little men have vulgar little fortunes, and fortunes are what we require." Elinor said nothing. She had long since learned that in this house, silence was safer than sympathy, and sympathy safer than truth. She slid her bowl a half-inch across the table, and when her mother's attention was elsewhere, she caught her youngest sister's eye and tipped her head toward the porridge, and Margaret, quick as a sparrow, spooned half of it into her own bowl before anyone noticed. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing Elinor did 4 mornings out of 7, and she had grown so practiced at it that her own stomach had stopped complaining, mostly, except at night, when the house was silent and there was nothing to distract her from the hollow ache of it. She was 19 years old, and she had been invisible in her own home for as long as she could properly remember. It was not cruelty, precisely, that made her mother look through her the way one looks through a window at bad weather. It was arithmetic. Cassandra was beautiful and biddable, and 21, of an age to be married before her looks began, God forbid, to fade, and a beautiful daughter well married was the only inheritance left to the Hartley family since Mr. Hartley had died 2 years before, leaving behind a mountain of debts, a leaking roof, and 3 fewer acres than the estate had once boasted, sold off 1 parcel at a time to keep the wolves from the door a little longer. Elinor, plain by comparison, though she was not plain. Not truly, only quiet, only the sort of face that did not announce itself in a room. Elinor was arithmetic that did not balance. She could sew, and she could manage a household on almost nothing, and she could soothe a crying child at 2 in the morning without waking the rest of the house, and none of these things could be spent at the draper's or handed to a moneylender in exchange for another 6 months of grace. The moneylender's name was Josiah Grimshaw, and he came that very afternoon, as he did every quarter, in a hired gig that rattled up the drive with the particular self-satisfaction of a man who owns half of what he is looking at. Elinor watched from the window of the small parlor as he descended, patting the pockets of his coat as though to reassure himself his ledger was still there, still real, still owed to him. He was not an old man, not precisely, but he had the soft, damp look of someone who had never done an honest day's labor and resented, in some obscure way, that anyone else had either. "Lady Hartley," He did not bow so much as incline his whole upper body, a gesture that managed to be both obsequious and insolent at once. "I trust you have given thought to the matter we discussed." "We have," Lady Hartley said, in the bright, brittle voice she used only for creditors and for God. "My eldest daughter is amenable to further acquaintance." Grimshaw's eyes slid past Cassandra, who arranged herself becomingly by the cold hearth, and found Elinor instead, standing quiet near the window, and something in his gaze made her skin crawl in a way she could not name and did not wish to examine. "The quarter's interest comes to £80, he said, turning back to Lady Hartley. "I do not say this to distress you, only to be plain. £80, and the principal still standing at 1100, and I have been a patient man. Madam, I have been patient 2 years running, but patience, like everything else, has its price." "You shall have your interest," Lady Hartley said, though Elinor knew, because she kept the household accounts now, quietly, in a hand her mother did not trouble to check, that they did not have £80, nor 80 shillings, nor very much more than 80 pence. "I had hoped," Grimshaw went on, and here his voice took on a wet, insinuating quality that made Elinor's stomach turn, "that we might discuss a more permanent arrangement. A man in my position does not often have the chance to marry into a family of quality, however reduced its circumstances. I have made my meaning plain before, Lady Hartley. I renew it now. Marry me one of your daughters. I do not insist upon Miss Cassandra, though she is a handsome girl, and I will forgive the debt entire. Refuse, and I shall have no choice but to call in the principal by Michaelmas, and you know as well as I do, madam, what that will mean for this house, and for these girls." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people doing arithmetic they do not wish to do aloud. It was Elinor who broke it, because someone had to, and her mother's mouth had gone thin and white with the effort of not weeping in front of a creditor. "You will forgive me, Mr. Grimshaw," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were pressed so hard together that her knuckles ached. "But you speak as though my sisters were a portion of your ledger, to be entered and settled. They are not for sale, sir, not even to clear an honest debt. And I think you know that, and I think you enjoy watching us squirm regardless." Grimshaw's small eyes widened, then narrowed, then, worse, softened into something like interest. "Spirited," he said, almost to himself. "I had not looked twice at you before, Miss Elinor. Perhaps I ought to have. Perhaps you ought to leave," Elinor said, "before my mother says something to you that she will regret only for its impoliteness." He left, eventually, still smiling that damp, considering smile, and Lady Hartley rounded on Elinor the moment the gig had rattled off down the drive. "You forget yourself," her mother said. "You forget yourself entirely. Do you imagine that pride will feed your sisters? Do you imagine that fine words will pay £1100? "No, Mamma," Elinor said quietly. "I imagine nothing of the kind. I only think there ought to be some limit to what we will sell." "There is no limit," her mother said, "when the alternative is watching them starve." And she said it not cruelly, but wearily, as a woman recites a truth she has grown too tired to soften, and then she went upstairs to lie down with a headache, and Cassandra went to admire the blue gown again, and Elinor went to the kitchen garden, because there was nowhere else in the house that was entirely hers, and because Margaret and little Alice were waiting there, as they always did, hoping she had saved them something from breakfast. She had. She always did. It was 3 days later that the letter came from London, and it changed everything, though none of them understood, not at first, quite how much. The letter was from a Mr. Price, solicitor, writing on behalf of a client he described only as a gentleman of very considerable estate and consequence, who had, it seemed, some old obligation to the late Mr. Hartley, a debt of honor from their father's generation, unspecified but apparently substantial, and who wished, in discharging it, to consider a marriage between his own household and the Hartley family. The letter was formal, careful and maddeningly vague as to particulars, save for one, before any contract was drawn. The gentleman's own man of business wished to visit Bramfield Hall in an unassuming capacity, to assess the property and, the letter said delicately, the general character and comfort of the household, and he would arrive within the fortnight under the name of Mr. Thomas Hale, seeking employment as a groom, so that he might observe without the constraint of ceremony. Lady Hartley read this letter 3 times, and then sat down rather suddenly in her chair. "A duke," she breathed, for Mr. Price's letterhead, though the letter itself named no title, bore beneath the solicitor's own name a small, unmistakable notation, "Solicitor to His Grace the Duke of Ashworth," that Lady Hartley had recognized instantly, the way a starving woman recognizes bread from 3 streets away. "Cassandra? Cassandra? Do you hear me? A duke." Cassandra heard, and for 3 days thought of nothing else, and Elinor, who ought perhaps to have felt some flicker of hope on her own account, felt instead only a small, private dread, because she had learned, in 19 years of being the daughter who did not signify, that good fortune in this house always seemed to land on other shoulders, and that her own task, whenever it arrived, was only ever to help someone else deserve it. Mr. Thomas Hale arrived on a wet Tuesday afternoon, on foot, leading a horse that was better bred than anything else on the property, and he was not at all what Elinor had expected of a groom. He was tall, taller than any of the local men, and dark-haired, and there was a stillness about him, a watchfulness, that put her in mind of a man accustomed to command rather than to service, though his coat was plain and his hands, when he touched the bridle, were roughened in a way that suggested real labor. He had a scar through one eyebrow, thin and old, and eyes the grey-green of the sea before a storm, and when he looked at her, only for a moment, in the stable-yard, where she had gone to see to the old mare who was going lame, there was something in his gaze that she could not name, something that felt almost like recognition, though they had never met. "Miss," he said, and touched his cap, and that was all. And she went back inside telling herself she had imagined the strange charge in the air between them, because grooms did not look at daughters of the house that way, and daughters of the house, particularly ones like her, did not notice when they did. He was, of course, no groom at all. He was Alexander Vane, 9th Duke of Ashworth, and he had come to Bramfield Hall in disguise, for reasons he had not fully explained even to his own solicitor, though Price, who had known him since boyhood, had a fair notion of them. The truth was that Alexander had inherited, along with his title and his 3 estates and his seat in the Lords, a debt so large that even the sale of half his father's horses and the closing of 2 wings of Ashworth House had not fully answered it. His father had gambled with the same reckless, charming abandon with which he had done everything else, and had died owing a fortune that his son now spent every waking hour attempting to repay. Marriage to money, or to a family whose alliance carried old obligations that might be called in as favors, was not romance. It was arithmetic, the same arithmetic that governed the Hartley breakfast table, only dressed in finer clothes. But Alexander had another reason, one he kept more closely still, which was that he had been engaged once before, briefly, to a young woman who had wept with joy at his proposal, and had, within a fortnight of learning the true state of his finances, wept with equal sincerity as she cried off. He had not trusted a woman's regard since. He wished, before he bound himself and his name to any daughter of the Hartley house, to see with his own eyes what manner of family he was joining, unfiltered by the performance that a duke's presence would inevitably provoke. And so, Thomas Hale, groom, seeking a fortnight's honest work and an honest look at the truth. He got more truth than he had bargained for within his first 3 days. He saw Lady Hartley cut a servant's wages in half for breaking a teacup that had been chipped before the girl ever touched it. He saw Cassandra, informed that Mr. Hale was newly hired and rather handsome for a groom, flirt with him shamelessly in the stable yard one afternoon, and then, upon learning he possessed nothing but the coat on his back, turn on her heel without so much as a farewell. He saw, too, the small private economies of the house, the mended stockings, the candles burned only halfway before being saved, the thin soups, and he understood with the particular clarity of a man who had once feared ruin himself, exactly how close to the edge this family stood. And he saw Elinor. He saw her carry her own dinner, untouched, out to the stable one evening and give it, without ceremony or comment, to the old groundskeeper who had been let go from the household staff for want of wages, and who now slept in the hay barn because he had nowhere else to go, and was too proud to beg. He saw her, on a morning when frost lay thick on the ground, take off her own shawl, her only shawl, grey and much mended, and wrap it around the shoulders of a tenant child who had come to the kitchen door barefoot and blue with cold, and he saw her send the child home not only warmed, but fed, with a heel of bread wrapped in a cloth, though he had watched her own portion at breakfast, and knew she had eaten perhaps half of what she ought. He said nothing of any of this to her. He only watched, in the quiet, careful way a man watches something he is beginning, against his own better judgment, to want. The recognition came fully one evening in the second week, when he found her in the walled garden at dusk, kneeling in the cold dirt among the dead rose bushes, working a small trowel through the frozen ground with hands that had gone raw and red. "Miss," he said. He always called her Miss, never her name, though he had learnt it the first day. "You'll do yourself an injury, working in this cold." "They were my father's roses," she said, not looking up. "He planted them the year I was born. My mother says we haven't the money for a gardener, and I dare say she's right. But I cannot bear to watch them die entirely for want of 10 minutes' attention. It isn't much. It's only turning the soil so it doesn't freeze solid over the roots. It won't save them, but it might." He crouched down beside her, and without asking, took up a second trowel that lay abandoned in the basket, and began to work the row beside hers. "You needn't," she said, startled. "I've nothing better to do with the evening," he said, which was a lie, since a duke has a great many things to do with an evening, none of which involve kneeling in frozen dirt beside a girl who does not know his name. Besides, seems a shame, letting something good go to waste, when it only wants a little care. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had not quite let herself do before, and something passed between them that neither of them named. Not that night, though he thought of it long after he had gone up to the cold little room above the stables that was his for the duration of his disguise, and lay awake turning it over, how she had said it might not be much, and done it anyway, how she gave away what little she had, without seeming to notice she was doing it at all, how no one else in that house had once, in a fortnight, asked her whether she herself had eaten enough, or slept enough, or wanted anything at all. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that night, alone in the dark. Not quite a smile. The almost. He knew, before the fortnight was out, whom he meant to marry. He had not expected to know it so plainly, or so soon, or with so little regard for the ledgers and obligations that had brought him there in the first place. But knowing it, and being free to act on it, were two very different things, and it was in the gap between them that the trouble began. Mr. Price arrived on the appointed day with the contract drawn and ready, for the fortnight's grace had run its course, and Grimshaw's Michaelmas deadline pressed close behind it, like a wolf at the door. The solicitor was shown into the good parlour, the one room still furnished well enough to receive a stranger of consequence, and Lady Hartley, trembling with hope and champagne she could not afford, but had bought regardless to celebrate the occasion, ushered Cassandra in wearing the blue gown, her hair dressed as fine as their remaining pins could manage. "The contract, Mr. Price said, laying the paper on the writing desk, requires only the lady's signature, madam, to bind the betrothal. His Grace's signature is already affixed, as he is presently engaged elsewhere and could not attend in person, but I assure you the document is entirely in order and entirely binding upon execution." He did not say where his Grace was presently engaged, because his Grace was, at that very moment, in the stable yard in his groom's coat, unaware that the contract had arrived a full day earlier than he had arranged, and Mr. Price, who had his own reasons for wishing the match secured before his employer's tender and troublesome conscience could interfere with good business sense, had not thought it necessary to send word. Cassandra approached the desk, quill in hand, radiant with triumph, and then stopped. "A moment," she said. "Before I sign, is he handsome, this Duke? Is he young? I have heard nothing of him at all, only that he is rich, and richness alone will not answer if he is a gouty old man of 60. His Grace is 28, Mr. Price said, with the careful patience of a man who has fielded this exact vanity before, and I am told is accounted a fine figure of a man by those who move in his circles. And where is he now, that he could not trouble himself to attend his own betrothal?" Here Mr. Price hesitated, only a fraction too long, and it was that hesitation, more than anything, that undid the whole careful arrangement, because Cassandra Hartley had a nose for weakness the way her sister had a hand for gentleness, and she smelled it now. "I understand, Mr. Price said carefully, that His Grace has taken certain precautions in arranging this match. He has, in point of fact, been present at Bramfield Hall these past 2 weeks, observing the household, in order to satisfy himself as to its character before committing his name." The room went very still. "Observing," Cassandra repeated. "You mean to say he has been here, in this house, watching us, like a spy in his own betrothal? It is not uncommon, Miss Hartley, for a man of large fortune to wish to know where." Cassandra's voice had climbed half an octave, and 2 spots of furious color stood high on her cheeks. "Where has he been, that none of us marked him?" Elinor, standing quiet by the window as she always did, felt the floor tilt beneath her before her mind had even finished the thought, because she already knew, with a certainty that turned her cold from crown to heel, exactly who Thomas Hale must be. "The new groom," Mr. Price admitted, seeing no further use in concealment, now that the thing was half guessed already. "Mr. Hale. He arrived a fortnight ago in that character, at His Grace's own instruction." 2. Cassandra did not wait to hear the rest. She threw down the quill so hard it skittered off the desk and onto the floor, and her voice, when it came, was thick with a fury that had nothing to do with morals and everything to do with pride. "A groom. He let me flirt with a groom, and laughed at me for it behind that plain coat. I do not doubt. No, no, I will not be made a fool of twice over. I will not marry a man who thought so little of me, or of any of us, that he must creep about in disguise like a common spy to judge whether we were fit for him. Let him keep his fortune and his deceit both. I want no part of a husband who begins a marriage with a lie." "Cassandra," Lady Hartley said, "Ashen, think what you are saying. The debt. I will not sign it." Cassandra's chin came up, and there was something almost admirable, Elinor thought distantly, in the sheer stubborn force of her sister's wounded vanity, even as it doomed them all. "Let Grimshaw have the house. Let him have all of it. I would rather be poor and unmocked than rich and made a fool." And she swept from the room and did not look back. And Lady Hartley sank into a chair with her hand pressed to her mouth, and Mr. Price stood holding a contract that required a Hartley signature within the hour, for he had a rider waiting to carry it back to town. And without it, without the betrothal secured that very day, the whole delicate arrangement, the one thing standing between this family and Michaelmas ruin, would collapse. It was Elinor who moved first. She did not remember deciding to. She remembered only the sound of Margaret's small dry cough from the room above, a cough that had lingered 3 weeks now for want of a fire kept lit through the night, and the memory of the tenant child's blue feet, and old Mr. Cobb sleeping in the hay because there was no room for him anywhere warm, and Grimshaw's damp. Considering smile, and she crossed the room before her mother had even risen from her chair, and took up the quill from where it had fallen, and looked at Mr. Price with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "The contract does not name a particular bride," she said. It was not quite a question. No, Miss Elinor, it does not. It was drawn to bind whichever daughter of the house. Then I will sign it." "Elinor," her mother breathed, half rising, "you cannot. He has deceived us. He has lived in this house under false. He has lived in this house," Elinor said. and her voice did not shake, though her whole body felt as though it were made of glass. "Watching us, yes, I do not know why. But I know that whatever else he is, he has been kind, in small ways, when no one asked him to be, and I would rather marry a man who watched us honestly and chose quietly, than one who never troubled to look at all. And I know that if this contract is not signed within the hour, Margaret and Alice will have no roof over their heads by Christmas, and I will not. I will not stand here and watch that happen for the sake of my sister's pride." She dipped the quill before her courage could fail her, and beneath the space where Cassandra's name ought to have stood, she wrote, in a hand that trembled only slightly, "Elinor Margaret Hartley," and then, because Mr. Price murmured that the document required the full style and name of both parties entered together to be valid, her hand hovering, her mind blank with panic and haste, she looked at the line above where the groom's own signature sat already inked and formal, "Alexander James Vane, Duke of Ashworth," and copied it, with her own hand, into the space the solicitor indicated, binding the two names together on the page in her own writing, hers and his, though he did not yet know it, though she had never once heard him called anything but Thomas Hale. She had signed the Duke's name herself. She had bound herself to a stranger she knew only as a groom, in the same breath that she had bound herself to save her sisters, and she did not know, setting down the quill with fingers gone numb, whether she had just performed an act of great courage or committed a fraud that might yet unravel everything. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Mr. Price took the signed contract, examined it with the swift, practiced eye of a man who has seen every manner of family drama play out over a writing desk, and pronounced it entirely in order. He left within the half hour, the rider already mounted and waiting, the document folded into a leather case bound for London, and, more immediately, for the small room above the stables where the man who called himself Thomas Hale had no notion that his own name had just been written onto a marriage contract by the hand of the one Hartley daughter he had never once expected to claim him by paper, before he could claim her by choice. Elinor did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed she had slept in since childhood, listening to Margaret's small cough through the wall, and to her own heartbeat, loud and frightened, and she thought, "I have married a man I do not know, whose true name I do not even know, and tomorrow he will discover what I have done, and there is no way of guessing whether he will be furious, or amused, or simply gone by morning." His fortnight's disguise concluded. His interest in this family concluded along with it, leaving her bound on paper to a man who might never come to claim it. He came at first light, and he was not dressed as a groom. She heard the carriage before she saw it, a proper carriage, gleaming black with a crest she did not recognize, picked out in gold upon the door, 4 matched greys in the traces, and 2 footmen in livery finer than anything Bramfield Hall had seen in a decade. She was in the kitchen garden when it arrived, because habit had carried her there even through her sleeplessness, and she straightened from the frozen rose bushes with dirt still on her hands, and watched a man descend from the carriage who was, and was not, the groom she had known. He wore a coat of dark blue superfine that fit him as though it had been made for no other body in the world, which it had. His boots were polished to a shine that reflected the grey morning sky. His cravat was tied with a precision no groom's fingers had ever managed, but it was the same face, the same scar through the eyebrow, the same grey-green eyes, the same stillness that she had mistaken, a fortnight ago, for a servant's proper deference, and understood now to be something far more natural to a man born to command. "Your Grace," she said, and the words tasted strange and formal in her mouth, applied to a man whose hands she had watched work a trowel beside her own not 4 days past. "Elinor," he said her given name for the first time, quietly, and there was something almost unsteady in it, for a man who otherwise carried himself with such perfect composure. "I understand there is a contract that requires my attention." "I did not know," she said. Before he could say anything further, before her nerve could fail her entirely. When I signed it, that you were, that Thomas Hale was. I thought only of my sisters, your grace. I swear it, I did not sign to entrap a duke. I did not even know I was doing any such thing. I only knew Cassandra had refused, and the debt would not wait, and I know, he said. Price sent word ahead by rider. I have read the whole account of it already, 3 times over, on the road here. He came closer, and there was something in his face she could not quite read, not anger, though she had braced for anger. Something quieter, and stranger, and, she thought, almost afraid. You signed my name to a contract, believing me a servant. You bound yourself to a man you thought possessed nothing but the coat on his back and a fortnight's wages. Tell me truly, Elinor, if you had known, that morning, that the groom kneeling beside you in the dirt was in fact the Duke of Ashworth, would you have signed at all? She considered the question seriously, because it deserved to be considered seriously, and because she found, standing there with the cold morning air between them, that she owed him at least that much honesty. I do not know, she said at last. I think I might have hesitated, out of fear that a duke's regard for a groom's fortnight could not possibly survive the discovery of his rank, that a man so elevated would look at what he had seen of me and think it charming in a servant's coat and beneath his notice in a lady's. But I did not know, and so I signed for the man I had actually met, not for the title I had not. I signed for Thomas Hale, who gave up his evening to save 6 rows of my father's roses that were most likely already dead. Whether that man and the Duke of Ashworth are truly the same person is a question I confess I have not yet finished answering. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. They are the same person, he said. I give you my word on that, for whatever a word is worth from a man who has spent a fortnight lying about his name. I came here in disguise, because I did not trust that any woman could regard me honestly if she knew from the first what I was worth in pounds and title, rather than in whatever it is a man is worth, when no one is watching him, to see if he behaves. I have been engaged before, Elinor, to a woman who loved a duke's fortune very well, and a duke's actual company hardly at all, and I did not wish to make that mistake twice. I did not expect, coming here, to find the one daughter in this house whom no one troubled to watch at all, and to find that she was, of everyone I observed, the only one entirely without artifice. I did not plan for you to sign my name before I had the chance to offer it to you honestly, but I confess, standing here now, that I am not sorry the contract is signed, only sorry that you signed it not knowing the whole truth of the man you were binding yourself to. And now that I know it, now, he said, I am asking you properly, as I ought to have found some way to do a fortnight ago, whether you will have me, not the groom, not the paper, but the man himself, debts and disguises and all. The contract may already bind us, but I find I want your consent as well as your signature, Elinor Hartley, and I will tear the paper myself if you tell me now that you do not give it freely. She looked at him for a long moment, at the fine coat and the scarred eyebrow and the eyes that had watched her. She understood now, far more closely than she had ever guessed, and she thought of the roses, and the shawl she had given away and never missed, and the trowel he had picked up without being asked. And she said, I give it freely, and something in his shoulders, some tension she had not known was there, eased all at once. Like a held breath finally let go. The wedding, once the contract's terms were confirmed and the banns read, was a quiet affair by the standards of a duke's household, though it seemed to Elinor grander than anything Bramfield Hall had witnessed in a decade. Her mother wept, whether from relief or genuine feeling Elinor did not trouble to examine too closely, and Margaret and Alice, fed and warm at last, stood at the front of the small church in new dresses that fit them properly for the first time in 2 years, and Cassandra did not attend at all, having removed herself to their aunt's house in Bath, in a temper that would take some months to cool. Grimshaw's debt was settled within the fortnight, the full principal paid without a murmur, and Elinor watched from an upstairs window as the moneylender's gig rattled away from Bramfield Hall for the last time, and felt something in her chest unclench that she had not realized, until that moment, had been clenched for 2 solid years. Ashworth House, when she came to it as a bride, was not the cold echoing pile she had half expected of a ducal seat. It was grand, certainly, grander than anything she had known, but it wore its grandeur a little wearily, like a coat inherited rather than chosen, and she understood within her first week that her husband, she was still learning to think of him so, still learning the shape of Alexander in her mouth, where Thomas Hale had briefly lived, carried the weight of his father's debts and his own reserve into every room he entered, the way she had once carried her family's hunger into every room of Bramfield Hall. It was the Dowager Duchess, Alexander's grandmother, who saw this most plainly, and who took to Elinor from their very first meeting with a warmth that startled them both. "You have the look of a girl who has gone hungry and never once complained of it," the old woman said, peering at her over spectacles perched low on her nose, in the small sitting room she kept for herself in the west wing. "I do not mean hungry only for bread, child, though I don't doubt that too. I mean hungry to be seen. My grandson has spent 6 years since his father died being seen only for his debts. I think perhaps the two of you have found each other by way of the same particular hunger, and I think, further, that it will serve you both very well if society does not manage to spoil it first." "Will society try?" Elinor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Society," said the Dowager Duchess, "always tries. It is the only occupation society has ever properly mastered." The months that followed were, in their quiet way, the happiest Elinor had known. She learned the running of Ashworth House the way she had once learned the running of Bramfield Hall on nothing at all, and found that a household with resources, properly managed, was almost a pleasure rather than a burden. She reopened the long-shuttered library, had the dust sheets taken off the good furniture in the morning room, coaxed the head gardener into replanting a bed of roses along the south terrace that reminded her, when they finally bloomed, of the ones she had tried so hard to save at Bramfield Hall. She learned servants' names, all of them, down to the youngest hall boy, and made a habit of asking after their families, which unsettled the older staff at first, and then gradually won them entirely. She brought a loaf of good bread to the kitchen table every single morning, and made certain, without being asked, that anything left over went home with whichever servant had family in want that week. A small habit that no one had instructed her in, and that she could not quite explain even to herself, save that she remembered too well what it was to watch a heel of bread mean the difference between a child sleeping and a child crying with hunger in the night. And Alexander, she learned him slowly, the way one learns a house room by room, discovering that the man who had seemed so still and guarded in his groom's coat was, freed of his disguise and his debts both, given to a dry, unexpected wit, and to long silences that were companionable rather than cold, and to a particular tenderness in small things. He brought her tea in the library without being asked, on evenings when she worked late over the household accounts. He learned without her ever telling him that she slept poorly when the fire burned too low, and saw to it, every night, that someone banked the coals properly before she retired. He found, in the 2nd month of their marriage, the exact spot in the garden where the transplanted roses had begun to bud, and brought her the very first bloom cut and wrapped in damp cloth, laid across her writing desk without a word, so that she found it there one morning like a small silent confession. "You needn't," she told him, echoing, though he did not know it, the words she had once said to him in the frozen garden at Bramfield Hall. "I've nothing better to do with my mornings," he said, and something moved at the corner of his mouth, and this time she let herself smile back, freely, without the old habit of checking first whether smiling was permitted. It could not last, of course, this quiet season of learning one another, undisturbed. No happiness in a story worth telling ever does. And it was Cassandra, in the end, who brought the disturbance, arriving in London that spring with their mother in tow, ostensibly for the season, In truth, because Bath had grown tiresome, and because word of Elinor's rise had reached her there and curdled, in the 2 months since, into something bitter enough to require an audience. The rumour began small, the way rumours always do. A word dropped at a card table, a raised eyebrow at the opera, a comment made just loudly enough to be overheard, and just softly enough to be denied. It was said that the new Duchess of Ashworth had not, in point of fact, been chosen by the Duke at all, but had tricked her way into the match by forging his signature upon a marriage contract while he was absent, taking advantage of a paper meant for her elder, far more suitable sister, who had refused the match upon discovering the deception at its heart. It was said, and here the rumour grew teeth, that Miss Elinor Hartley, as she had been, was known in her own family for a certain slyness, a habit of taking what was not offered to her, and that the ton would do well to guard its purses and its husbands both. Now that such a woman moved among them with a duchess's consequence, and none of a duchess's honest claim to it, Elinor heard the first whispers of it at Lady Featherstone's rout, in the particular way one hears such things, not directly, never directly, but in the sudden silence that falls when one enters a room too soon. In the too bright smile of an acquaintance who has clearly just been discussing something else, in the way Cassandra, resplendent across the room in a gown that cost more than the whole of the Hartley household budget once had, met her eyes and smiled, slow and satisfied, before turning deliberately away. "She is telling everyone," Elinor said to Alexander that night, sitting very still at her dressing table while her maid took the pins from her hair, "that I forged your signature, that I stole what was meant for her. She knows it is not true. She was there. She refused the match, with her own mouth in front of Mr. Price. And still, she tells it." "She is angry," Alexander said, "and angry people rarely trouble themselves with truth when a lie serves their pride better. It will pass, Elinor. Rumours always do, given time and no fresh fuel. And if it does not pass before it costs you your seat in the Lords, or costs Margaret her chance at a decent match when she is of age, or costs, it will not come to that." But his jaw had tightened, and she saw, for the first time since their wedding, the old shadow of the man who had once distrusted every woman's regard cross briefly behind his eyes, and she understood, with a small cold jolt, that some part of him, however small, however unwilling, still feared, beneath all his tenderness, that the world might yet prove his first instinct right, that a woman's affection could not survive contact with a title and a fortune without turning, sooner or later, to calculation. She resolved, that night, that she would not let that fear take root unchallenged, though she did not yet know how. The rumour came to its head at the Ashworth ball itself, an irony Cassandra could not resist. Choosing the very event meant to formally present the new Duchess to society as the stage for her final performance. She waited until the rooms were fullest, until the Duke himself had stepped away briefly to attend a matter with his steward, and then she moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a woman who has rehearsed her lines, and stopped before a cluster of the most influential matrons in the room, Elinor standing not 10 feet away, near enough to hear every word. "I confess I find it remarkable," Cassandra said, pitched just loud enough, "how quickly some women learn to wear a title, when they have had so very little practice wearing anything of quality at all. Though I suppose forgery requires a certain steadiness of hand, my sister always did have a talent for taking up a pen and writing what was never truly hers to write. I ought to know. I was there, the day she signed a duke's own name onto a contract meant for me, while he himself knew nothing of it, a fine beginning for a marriage, is it not, built upon a lie set down in another woman's hand?" The murmur that ran through the room was immediate, delighted, cruel in the bright, bloodless way that society's cruelty always is, and Elinor felt the old familiar instinct rise in her, the instinct to say nothing, to absorb it, to make herself small and quiet, and let the storm pass over her the way it always had at her mother's table, But she was not at her mother's table any longer. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, and Alexander's voice, when it came, was close behind her, quiet and utterly without doubt. "You are half right, Miss Hartley," he said, and the room, which had been murmuring, went silent all at once, for a duke's voice carries in a way that a jilted sister's does not. He had returned in time to hear every word, and he came now to stand beside Elinor, not before her, not shielding her as though she required shielding, but beside her, which she understood, even in that moment, to be the greater compliment. She did sign my name. I have never denied it, nor asked her to. What you neglect to mention, madam, before this whole assembly, is the manner of it. I had spent a fortnight in your own household disguised as a groom, at my own instruction and no deception of your sister's making, in order to judge for myself the character of the family I meant to join. In that fortnight, I watched your sister give away her own food to a groundskeeper too proud to beg, her own shawl to a tenant child blue with cold, her own comfort, again and again, to anyone in her small orbit who needed it more than she did, while asking nothing for herself and expecting no one to notice that she had gone without. I watched you, Miss Hartley, refuse a contract that would have saved your family from ruin, out of nothing more than wounded vanity at having once flirted with a man you believed beneath you. And when that refusal left your mother and your younger sisters facing the loss of their home within the hour, I watched your sister, this woman you now call a forger, take up the pen herself, not to steal a fortune, but because she could not bear to watch 2 children go hungry for the sake of a debt she had no part in creating. She signed my name, because there was no time to send for the man himself, and because she trusted, even not knowing who I truly was, that the groom who had knelt beside her in a frozen garden and helped her save 6 rows of dying roses was not a man who would abandon a family in want if he could prevent it. She was right to trust it. I have never once regretted the hand that wrote my name that day, and I will not stand in my own house and hear it called a crime, when the truth is that it was the single bravest and kindest act I have witnessed in my 26 years upon this earth. He turned then, fully to Elinor, and took her hand before the whole assembled room, and his voice, when he continued, dropped lower, meant for her though the silence was so complete that every word carried regardless. "I did not marry a forger," he said. "I married the only woman I have ever known, who gave without counting the cost of it, and who never once, in all the time I watched her unseen, imagined that anyone was watching at all. I love her for it. I will go on loving her for it in every room in England that cares to whisper otherwise, and I would be glad, madam," this last to Cassandra, whose face had gone from triumphant to ashen in the space of his speech, "if you would kindly remember, the next time you wish to entertain a ballroom at my wife's expense, that I was in that house too, and I remember everything I saw there rather more clearly, I think, than you remember your own refusal." The silence held a moment longer, and then broke, not into further whispers, but into something Elinor had not expected at all, a low murmur of approval, here and there a soft startled laugh, one dowager near the front dabbing quite openly at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and declaring to her neighbor that she had not heard anything half so romantic since her own girlhood. Cassandra, finding herself abruptly the villain of a story she had meant to author entirely to her sister's disadvantage, made a stiff, wordless curtsy, and withdrew from the room amid a silence far less kind than the one that had greeted her arrival, and did not trouble the Ashworth name again with rumor for the whole of that season, nor, in truth, for any season after. Elinor stood very still in the circle of that enormous, glittering room, her hand in her husband's, and found that she was crying, quietly, without quite meaning to, and Alexander bent his head close to hers and said, low enough now that only she could hear it, "I ought to have said all of that a great deal sooner. I am sorry it took a ballroom full of witnesses to make me say it properly at all." "You said it," she said, "when it mattered most. That is enough. That has always been enough. For me. 10 months had passed since that ballroom, and Bramfield Hall, when Elinor returned to it that autumn with her husband at her side, bore almost no resemblance to the cold, decaying house of her girlhood. The roses along the south wall had been cut back and tended and, though it was late in the season for blooms, showed new green growth pushing up through soil that had been properly turned and fed all through the spring. The roof no longer leaked. Margaret, 13 now and rosy-cheeked in a way she had never been as a child in that house, came running out to meet the carriage with Alice close behind her, both of them dressed warmly, and neither of them, Elinor was glad to see, remembering hunger any longer as anything more than an old, half-forgotten story. Old Mr. Cobb, restored to his cottage and his pension both, tipped his hat to them from the kitchen garden, where he now kept himself busy growing vegetables enough for half the parish, a task Elinor had quietly arranged for him the very week she had married, and had never once mentioned to anyone, least of all to him, that it had been arranged at all. Lady Hartley, greeting them in the good parlour restored now, its furniture no longer draped in dust sheets, a proper fire burning in the grate, was warmer toward Elinor than she had ever been in 19 years of daughterhood, though Elinor suspected, not unkindly, that this warmth owed a good deal to her present rank, and rather less to any true change of heart, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she no longer minded the distinction very much. She had stopped needing her mother's notice the way she once had. She had found it, instead, in 100 smaller places, in her sister's health, in a duke's steady regard, in an old woman's spectacled kindness, in her own 2 hands, which had never stopped being capable of tending what others let die, only now had something worth tending that would not, this time, be taken from her. That evening, in the small breakfast room where she had once slid half her porridge silently across the table, Elinor set out the bread herself, still warm from the oven, and cut it, and passed the first slice to Margaret, and the second to Alice, and kept the third for herself, and ate every bite of it without saving back so much as a crumb, because for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, there was no need to save anything at all. There would be more bread tomorrow, and more the day after that, for as long as she cared to ask for it. Alexander, watching her from across the table with that quiet, considering stillness that had once made her mistake him for a servant, and now made her certain, beyond any doubt, that she had married the very best man she had ever known, reached over and took her hand beneath the tablecloth, and said nothing at all, because nothing needed saying. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the almost, though these days, she noted with a private joy, the almost came so easily and so often that it had very nearly stopped being an almost at all. Outside, the last of the season's roses held on stubbornly against the coming frost, and inside, the fire burned high and steady in every hearth in the house, and no one, not one soul under that roof, went to bed hungry that night, nor any night after. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.